going to continue my series on Enoch. This is the Lost Scrolls of Enoch, and what I'm trying to do is break down the book of Enoch, or the books of Enoch, and make it more accessible to a general audience. So what I want to get onto today is Enochian Judaism. Significant observations about first or Ethiopic Enoch. So I have this book. If you're interested in the book of Enoch, I recommend this. This is The Lost Prophet, the Book of Enoch and Its Influence on Christianity by Margaret Barker. She's a British professor. She's about 80 years old. Margaret Barker, a former president of the Society of Old Testament Studies, prolific author specialized in reconstructing the background of the New Testament throughout thought, in the life of her, in light of researches in the Hebrew Bible and intertestamental Judaism. Among her other books are the Older Testament, Survival Themes from the Ancient World Cult and Sectarian Judaism and Early Christianity, Gate of Heaven, History and Symbolism of the Temple in Jerusalem, and the Great High Priest, the Temple Roots of Christian Liturgy. It's very interesting. But what I want to look at is this theory that she proposes, and it makes a lot of sense, is that when did Judaism as we know it develop? Actually, like I said, there's different forms of Judaism today. In the past, there are different forms of Judaism that passed away. And just for instance, they found these Aramaic scrolls in Elephantine, Egypt. Josiah, my brother, and I went to Elephantine, Egypt, and we're doing our little study tour of Egypt, trying to put my research for Egypt, the Exodus together. And they had a temple of Yahweh in southern Egypt. Apparently it's a full functioning temple of Yahweh. And they had a very distinctive form of Judaism. They're worshiping Yahweh, but they're still worshiping Yahweh along with a couple of other Canaanite gods, apparently. And they were in communication with Jerusalem, and they're getting instructions about how to properly observe certain feast days based on the records we have from Jerusalem, from the high priest. So that would obviously represent a form of Judaism that died out, that we learned from this random, unexpected archaeological discovery. And when we read the Bible, sometimes we just look at Jeremiah. I'm reading through Jeremiah right now, and with the prophets had to contend with so-called pagan practices that were deeply ingrained in society around them and deeply ingrained in Judaism. You had these reform movements led by Hezekiah and then by Josiah to reform Judaism, to bring people more in line with the Torah. And of course, that's what Ezra and Nehemiah did. The Torah had been lost as it was during Jeremiah's time, and Ezra found the Torah scrolls, collated them, and structured them in the form we know them today, and came back and taught the people Torah. And it's the first time they're exposed to Torah as we know it. Of course, these are based on very ancient scrolls from the time of Moses, but they're introduced to it through Ezra and Nehemiah. So Judaism changed from being a Yahweh speak through the voice of the prophets, and then it changed to studying the centrality of the Torah, right? Observance of Torah. But if you read in Ezra and Nehemiah, there's kind of a backlash among certain people. So we see especially in the book of Nehemiah where he has opponents. And it doesn't really explain their point of view, what they're trying to do. But she's trying to argue, and this makes a lot of sense. So imagine this: you have these ancient forms of Judaism, which she claims goes back to the temple worship, temple worship of Yahweh among the kings of Jerusalem. Very primitive forms of Judaism. Now they have the Torah, and Ezra and Nehemiah are bringing about. He has the authority. Ezra and Nehemiah have the authority of the Persian government to bring about conformity of the Jewish people to the Torah. But there's some opposition. And as I was mentioning a few weeks ago, what are Ezra and Nehemiah trying to do? Well, one of the things they're trying to do is racial purity. We're not going to intermarry with the pagans. Also, excluding Gentiles from Torah worship. And it mentions that, they're reading the Torah, it's like, okay, these people aren't allowed to worship the temple. We're not going to allow them to worship anymore. It's interesting, in the last section of the book of Isaiah, it talks about a more open, inclusive worship. So, just imagine you're one of these groups, more ancient form of Judaism, and then you have the Torah brought in. How do you maintain a Jewish identity apart from the Torah, or maintain your distinctive beliefs? And one way would be to appeal to a time before the giving of the law of Moses at Mount Sinai, to an ancient prophet who's the progenitor of all mankind, in a sense. Someone who had a unique relationship with God. In a way, by being earlier than the law of Moses, it could be seen as, in a sense, as taking precedence over it. And also, finding a prophet who existed before circumcision, before the dietary requirements, before before there were Gentiles and Jews, right? This prophet would have a more universal message for all mankind, and not a more exclusive message or exclusionary message just for the Israelites and the Jewish people. So she's calling this Enochian Judaism, a form of Judaism, a distinct form of Judaism, centered around not the Torah of Moses, but around the prophethood and the message associated with Enoch. And it's like, well, should we call this Judaism at all? I think so, because if you look in the book of Enoch, he gives his perspective in a parable of history, starting with creation and going to, I guess, the time of the Maccabees, well, thereafter, or before the Maccabees. So we do have a perspective in the book of Enoch, of Jewish history. So some people talk about Yahwehism or Yahwism, because it's believed that there were people who worshiped the god Yahweh, who might not have been Hebrews or Jewish at all. People in the area of Mount Seir and Sinai. This seems to be very ancient, like the Kenites. I mean, the Bible places the Kenites in Canaan before Abraham got there, and the Kenites are presented in the Bible as being fanatical devotees of Yahweh. So you have Yahwehism, and then who are the Jewish people anyway? That's one of the 12 tribes. If you look at the Samaritans don't call themselves Jewish. The Samaritans say that we are the Samaritan Israelites. They only observe the Torah. They have their own books. Actually, this is kind of interesting. Of course, to them, Torah is scripture. I think they use the book of Joshua, but they don't look at Joshua as being scripture. It's just a book, right? The only Bible they have is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But they have other books that they've written about their history. One's called the Assatir, which is apparently in Aramaic, which is kind of a midrash telling their interpretation of the Torah. And they have other books, chronicles of their history, written in their form of Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic and other languages. It's kind of interesting to look at the ancient writings that they have preserved. So you have Yahwehism, you have Judaism, you have the Samaritan Israelite religion, but she is mentioning a distinct form of Judaism called Enochian Judaism. So this is Enochian Judaism, it's not Enochian Yahwehism or Enochian Israelitism, or what do you want to call it. She's calling this Enochian Judaism. So I'm going to read some things and we'll conclude. This is a very deep and interesting subject. Enochian Judaism, significant observations about first or Ethiopian Enoch. The Torah is a revelation given to the Israelites, including the Jewish people. The book of Enoch contains a more universal message. It's a message given to all mankind before the exclusive Abraham covenant. or the revelation of the law of Moses at Mount Sinai. It's a universal message, not a covenant restricted to the Israelites, right? So, you have the universal message to all mankind from the prophet Enoch, and then later Abraham becomes a progenitor of the Hebrews and the Edomites and the Israelites, and then the law is given to these people, and it's more of a a cultural national religion for the Jewish people. So it's more exclusivary towards them. We are the chosen people. We are distinct. It's a distinct message for the Jewish people, right? It's not a universal message. I mean, this is the problem you have the early church, right? You're confronted with this issue. It's like, well, for a Gentile to be saved, he has to become part of Israel. You have to be circumcised. That's what some early Christians were teaching. And Paul says, no. You can be saved as a believer in the Messiah of Israel without becoming an Israelite, because he's the Son of Man, he's the Son of all mankind. So that's a big controversy in the early church. Margaret Barker, in The Lost Prophet, just this book, which if you're interested in Enoch studies, I recommend. The Book of Enoch and its influence on Christianity argues. Enoch is the writing of a very conservative group whose roots go back to the time of the First Temple. Of course, that's a big theme of her works, this First Temple. The First Temple is, of course, Solomon's Temple. So this is a primitive, pre-exilic Jewish sect, apparently, that may not have been Torah-centric, right? People don't often think about this, but the Old Testament mentions the Torah as being lost and later restored under King Josiah and then again under Ezra. Large sections of the Old Testament are not Torah-centric. Even though the Torah was lost, the prophets of Yahweh continue to speak His word. Take, for instance, what happened is Josiah. We're gonna restore the temple. Our temple has fallen into disarray. It needs reconstruction on it. The building has structural problems. Let's rebuild. Let's restore. Work on the temple. While they're working on the temple, they find the Book of Deuteronomy, which had been lost for ages, and that was revolutionary. It's like we didn't even we've lost this book for decades, and now all of a sudden we have the Book of Deuteronomy again. We're not in alignment to the Book of Deuteronomy. He called a prophetess, Huldah. So even though they had lost the Torah, Yahweh was still speaking. And as I mentioned, and she mentions it here, it's like, after the story of Genesis, Adam and Eve aren't hardly ever mentioned again. Moses himself is rarely mentioned. Even Abraham is rarely mentioned after the book of Genesis. But we are very, very Torah-centric. And this is a problem with the Messianic movement, I think, is that we should look at the Bible, the Old Testament, as a totality, right? The Jewish people do this, and I think some Messianic Jews do it, and they're wrong to do it, where they place the Torah, it's like it's more inspired than the rest of the Old Testament, and it's not. Isaiah is just as inspired as Numbers and Deuteronomy. They elevate the Torah in authority over the rest of the Old Testament, over the rest of the Bible, sometimes over the Gospel itself, and that's not right. The Bible is all equally inspired. The Bible doesn't say that a certain section is more inspired than the rest of the Bible. I would say the New Testament obviously takes precedence over the Old Testament. Of course, the Old Testament's the Word of God. That's the Bible that Jesus used. But it's all Christocentric or Messiah-centric. All right, so I'm saying it's like, people think about how we conceive of Judaism is all about the Torah of Moses, right? But we're saying it's like, no, there are forms of Judaism that weren't centered around, and we see it in our Bible, right? They're not centered around Torah observance. I mean, how could their religion be centered around strictly obeying the 614 commandments of Moses when the Torah had been lost for decades? That's what the Bible says. But the prophets were still ministering. Yahweh was still speaking to the prophets. And as we see, it is Ezra and Nehemiah, inspired by Yahweh, inspired by God, who brought the Torah, instructed people in the Torah, and made the Torah the center of Jewish life, as it is to this day. And I'm not knocking or criticizing Ezra and Nehemiah. I think they're used by God in a mighty way. But I'm just saying that, people think it's very strange to think of a form of Judaism that's not centered on the Torah. But if we read our Bible carefully, that's just for a lot of Jewish history, that was the case. Margaret Barker describes this ancient and alternate form of Judaism as Enochian Judaism. She is presenting Enochian Judaism as a distinct branch of Judaism that no longer exists. The main peculiar aspects of Enochian Judaism are the following. I want to mention that Enochian Judaism may have died out, but not for producing second Enoch and influencing early Christianity. I'm going to have, there's going to be a series of books on this. And the first one is this one. It's just an overall a view, a bird's eye view, basically, summary view of the book of Enoch, and second and third Enoch as well. The second book will be about Enoch and canon, how the story of Enoch's in the Bible, like it or not. It's part of the Bible story. And then I'm going to have yet another book about how Enoch was used by the early church fathers as part of the Bible. But I'm also going to talk about how at Judaism in the time of Yeshua, Enoch was hugely influential. The Book of Jubilees. There's a lot of Jewish literature from before the time of Christ and after, during and after the time of the Messiah. We see a great influence. Of course, the rabbis, just like the later church fathers, the early church fathers are using Enoch. The later church fathers suppressed the book of Enoch. So the Jewish people at the time of Yeshua, Jesus, are using the book of Enoch. Decades later, the rabbis begin repressing it. So let's look at these attributes of what she calls Enochian Judaism. The idea of the origin of evil caused by the fallen angels who came on the earth to unite with human women. These angels are considered ultimately responsible for the spread of evil and impurity on the world. And this is something that outrages Reformed theologians and Calvinists, right? And that theological system is very important, that Adam is worse than Satan. Adam's the one that brought sin into the world, and Adam alone. So this idea that these demonic spirits had any influence whatsoever in the fall of man is that's anathema. They won't accept it, and that's why some of these Calvinists get so passionate and worked up and angry and just beside themselves with fury against the book of Enoch. It's like, look, I'm not saying it's inspired. I'm just saying it's historically relevant and important to understand the Jewish culture at the time of Jesus. They just lose their minds over that idea. The absence in First Enoch of former parallels with specific laws and commandments found in the Mosaic Torah, and of references to issues like Shabbat or Sabbath observance and the rite of circumcision. The Sinaitic covenant and Torah are not of central importance in the book of Enoch, and in certain parts of the Bible, the Sinaitic covenant and Torah are not of central importance. That's the way we perceive it. That's the way we interpret the Bible. But that's, how could the Torah be the central focus of Judaism, before Josiah? And yet you have prophets like in ministry, like Elijah and Elisha. Of course, they're aware of Moses and what he did. They just didn't have access. The scroll, according to the Bible, the scrolls were lost. They're lost. I guess they had a Dead Sea type scroll thing where in a cave or a cavern somewhere in the Temple Mount or in some chamber, they lost the Bible, but God's work went on. Or they lost not the Bible itself, but the Torah. The concept of the end of days, the time of final judgment that takes place, that takes the place of promised earthly rewards. That's true. One thing about the Torah is it doesn't deal with the nature of the afterlife. It insinuates certain things, but it doesn't. That's why that was an issue, because the Sadducees. Well, Moses didn't say anything about life after death, so we go only by what Moses says. So is there life after death? The Pharisees said yes. The Sadducees said no. But Enoch says yes. The rejection of the second temple, that's Herod's temple, basically, or Zerubbabel's temple before that. The rejection of second temple's sacrifice is considered impure. According to Enoch 89:73, the Jews who then returned from exile reared up that tower, the temple, and they began to place a table before the tower and put all the bread on it that was polluted and not pure. So, this is kind of interesting. I was thinking about Ezra and Nehemiah and their opponents. And the issue is, it's like, let's have a parallel. Let's go back to, let's look at the, with American history, I think it's a way to look at it. Well, it's two parallel points. So you look at Ezra and Nehemiah, and we look at their opponents, and we don't really get their perspective. I think we do in the last part of Isaiah. I think that seems to be showing the perspective of people who are opposed to the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah. So let me give you an example of, two people opposing each other, but both of them are right in some ways. Like Erasmus of Rotterdam and Martin Luther, right? So it's like, I look at these two men, and actually I respect both of them, right? Martin Luther boldly began the Protestant Reformation, but he's a bit of a hothead, and I think that Erasmus of Rotterdam was more correct in theology and had some salient points against Martin Luther. But it's Luther that, I guess he's kind of a hell raiser or a heaven raiser, however you want to put it. But if you look at these two men, it's like they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they're both. I think they're both men of God who are being used by God in different ways, and they had this, they're butting their heads. Or with American history, we have the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. That's another thing. Like, everything about America is against the United States Constitution. When we had our American Revolution, they didn't have a Constitution. We weren't fighting for the United States Constitution. For over 10 years or so, after we gained complete independence, we didn't have a Constitution. We had the Articles of Confederation. Then they called the Constitution Convention. There's certain things that I didn't like. I don't know, that they exceeded their mandate. They met in secret. They didn't include the Bill of Rights. They didn't acknowledge God properly in the Constitution. So certain things I don't think were carried out properly. They're supposed to reform or revise the Articles of Confederation, and instead they just threw out the Articles of Confederation and produced a new Constitution. But to ratify the Constitution, there's this great struggle, and you had the Federalists who were advocating for the Constitution, and you had the Anti-Federalists who were against it. And I'm a patriot. I love our Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights. But the reason why we have a Bill of Rights is because of the Anti-Federalists. It's like, it wouldn't have been confirmed by the nation without, the Federalists realized they had to concede to the Anti-Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists were people that fought in the Revolutionary War. They were patriots too, and some of their criticisms were correct and valid, and that's why we had the Bill of Rights. To me, the Bill of Rights is more important than Article Section 1, Section 2, Article 3. To me, the Bill of Rights is the most important part of the Constitution. But it was the Anti-Federalists who were responsible for that, and they defeated the Federalists. The Federalists, they had to concede, okay, for us to get the approval and ratify this Constitution, we concede that we made a mistake. We should have included the Bill of Rights in it. So I think the Articles of Confederation had some of these rights written into it. I don't know why they wrote a Constitution without including them. It's a very disturbing and troublesome oversight. So, so what I'm saying is you have Ezra and Nehemiah have their own opponents. Ezra and Nehemiah are obviously are being used of God in mighty ways, but that doesn't mean their opponents are wrong about everything or that they're evil people. Well, we see it. Just read it in Isaiah. Questioning the whole system of the animal sacrifices, questioning excluding the Gentiles, saying my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations, even advocating that, like, if you're a eunuch, you couldn't go and worship in the temple, and Isaiah says, it's your heart and how you worship. These people shall not be excluded. So in the Bible, whoever wrote that part of Isaiah represents the point of views of the people who are opposing Ezra and Nehemiah, and apparently their points of view are also seen in the book of Enoch. The Dead Sea, by the way, the Dead Sea Scroll community also would not worship in the temple because they thought that the temple rituals were not being performed correctly. The presentation of heaven in 1 Enoch 1 through 36, not in terms of Jerusalem temple and its priests, but modeling God and his angels on the ancient Near Eastern or Hellenistic court with its kings and courtiers. A solar calendar in opposition to the lunar calendar, using the second temple, a very important aspect for the determination of the dates of religious feasts. We actually have this problem today. Someone says, we don't know if it's Yom Teruah or not, you know. It's like Michael Rood. Only Michael Rood can determine when a feast day begins. He has to go out, you know. He has to see the moon with his own eyes and have 2 or 3 other people, you know. He's like the groundhog seeing his shadow. If Michael Rood doesn't see a shadow, then no Jewish feast can begin. So this controversy of the lunar versus solar calendar goes back to ancient times. I mean, I don't even think about it. You just look at a calendar or pick up your phone to find out what day it is, but it's a big deal in ancient times. Even in the church, we use the Gregorian calendar, but the Eastern Orthodox, they use the Julian calendar. And that's why the Orthodox Easter is like a week after Western, you know, Catholic and Protestant Easter, because they use a different calendar. And to me, it's like, it's hard for me to get, you know, it's not something that interests me, you know, the calendar. But the thing is, we know that the Earth is orbiting the sun, right, revolving around the sun, and our days are you know, the Earth is rotating on its axis. And so a year is what? It's, you know, a full orbit around the rotation around the sun. So Enoch is correct. We should have a solar calendar. Now the word month, of course, does mean month, but it's not, you know, it's as important as the moon is. A year is a circular rotation, or I guess an oval rotation around the, or elliptical rotation around the sun. So Enoch is correct about what is a year. A year is a full rotation around the sun. An interest in the angelic world that involves life after death. And as I mentioned, Enochian Judaism may have died out, but not before producing second Enoch and influencing early Christianity. I have this New Testament by Hart, the Hart translation. He has a lot of footnotes in there and commentary about the influence of the Book of Enoch, as she discusses in her book here, The Lost Prophet, the Book of Enoch and its influence in Christianity. I want to read what she actually says, and then we'll conclude this section. I've already mentioned the hostility that Calvinists have towards Enoch, because with their deterministic system, their predestination system, sin and evil. I mean, some of these Calvinists believe that Adam is far more wicked than Satan himself could ever hope to be. And then it's like Adam is the one that, but then they believe in predestinationism, so they also believe that, you know, God caused Adam to sin. Nothing can happen without God, you know, God's sovereign control over every minute thing. But that's Calvinistic determinism. We'll have to discuss that later. So this is page 18 and 19 of Margaret Barker's book on the Lost Prophet, the Book of Enoch. This book was it 2005? That's what it says here. It was first published in 1988. I thought it was older than that. But all right, the Book of Enoch has many points of contact with the Old Testament, but even more points where it is very different. It has no place for elaborate sacrificial cult at the temple. No actual quotations of the Old Testament as we know it, except for the Song of the Angels, Holy, 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 which is the same as Isaiah 6, verse 3. So this whole sacrificial system, the book of Leviticus, you know, you must cut the goat's throat, and dip its blood in a dish, and then take your thumb and put the blood on your thumb and your big toe, and then on your right ear, and on your left ear, and then smear the blood. You know, all these elaborate blood sacrifice rituals are not in the Book of Enoch. So it says it has no great role of the law of Moses. Even these people that rejected what Ezra and Nehemiah are trying to do, you know, they knew of Moses, they acknowledged Moses as a prophet of Yahweh, but they opposed what Ezra and Nehemiah were trying to do. What type of Judaism was this which had no real place for the law and none for the sacrificial cult? What it does have is a great emphasis on the day of judgment, and the mediation and revelation of Enoch was a wise man, a scribe, and a priest. It has many points of contact with Isaiah and the Psalms, and it seems to have kept alive many ancient traditions that have faded from prominence in the Old Testament books. First Enoch itself says that the changes development after the Jewish people came back from Babylon were a bad thing. Those who built the new temple were impure and apostate. And I mentioned this, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I will read it, because it's that quotation I read earlier left some things out. This is 1 Enoch chapter 89, 73, and 93:9. And they began to build as before. They reared up that tower, which is the temple of Jerusalem. And it was named the high tower. And they began again to place a table before the tower, and they put the bread on it that was polluted and not pure. Then after that, in the 7th week, shall an apostate generation arise, and many shall be its deeds, and all its deeds shall be apostate. Some of these groups, they rejected the idea of the temple itself, and of sacrifices. We see that throughout certain psalms, right? And Jesus himself, he threw out the sacrificial animals. So this says here, this implies that we have in Enoch the writing of a very conservative group whose roots go back to the time of the first temple when there were still kings in Jerusalem. If this is correct, it is of very great importance for our understanding of Christianity. The central theme of Christianity is that Jesus was the Messiah, the anointed, the true King of Israel. Early Christianity has always claimed to be the fulfillment of the Old Testament. What would have been more natural than the ideas of the Messiah that were based on the ancient hopes and ideals of the earlier kings? In Enoch, we most certainly have an echo of the earlier ways, and Enoch has been preserved only as a Christian book, which is interesting. It's Christians that have preserved Enoch in its entirety, right? The Christians, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Even though it was written a long time before the time of Jesus, I think everybody can see that. Scholars might say, oh, well, I mean, they don't know when it's written, hundreds of years before the time of Jesus. Some certain parts they try to say, well, this is written during the Maccabean era, around the Maccabean conflict. Christian churches saw some special importance in this work and influenced much of their thinking about the Messiah. The fate of Enoch confirms this. Some Jewish teachers and early Christians had a very negative attitude towards it. As I mentioned, it was influenced on early Christianity and Judaism at the time of Jesus, but later it was suppressed. And if not for the Ethiopian church, we would have lost Ethiopia. We would have lost the Book of Enoch. We preserved sections of it. I was looking at the Greek section. They found in an archaeological discovery, like chapter 1 to 30, roughly, of the Book of Enoch in Greek. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have, it seems to be originally written in Aramaic. We have several scrolls of the Book of Enoch, but they're fragmentary. There's a story that someone in a private collector has a complete Book of Enoch in Aramaic, but that's not for certain. It's not accessible to the scholarly community or to the public yet, if such a thing exists, which it probably does. It's kind of a sad thing. So why are you hoarding this important manuscript? It's a shame. But I think Professor Strudel said that he'd seen photographs of this complete Book of Enoch in Aramaic, a very well preserved scroll. But some private collector has it, and he's hoarding it. But it was the Ethiopian church Christians that preserved the Book of Enoch for us. Like I said, Enochian Judaism may have died out, but not before producing Second Enoch and influencing early Christianity. Of course, Third Enoch, which is a book of Jewish cultism and mysticism, is also based on traditional understandings of the Book of Enoch. Some of these traditions are preserved in the Midrash and certain Jewish sources. So I think it's very interesting to look at Enoch as also a vestige of earlier but form of Judaism that has disappeared. Enochian Judaism. But in a sense you could say we have Enochian Christianity, maybe, because in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church anyway, and at the time of the fathers. Jesus is, if the Book of Similitudes is part of the original Book of Enoch, all these teachings about the Messianic figure called the Son of Man, obviously are an important part of understanding the gospel and story of Jesus. So, join me next time as we continue to work through the lost scrolls of Enoch. Thank you, and God bless you.